Right, so I'd like to welcome David Orme to the podcast today. David, you are the Global Head of Services Procurement at Pontoon. And before you came into this kind of MSP, workforce management type role where you're helping other organizations manage their services procurement spend, you had some serious adventures in this world on the client side yourself. And I'm really pleased to chat to you today, and hopefully we can go into some of that background and look at how you became one of those people who can talk the talk, but has also walked the walk in this area. So thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Johnny. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Excellent stuff. So if we wind the clock back, what I'd really like to do is just start off by looking at how you got into procurement in the first place. I know you've got consulting in the background somewhere early on in your career. Would you just be able to give a little bit of an introduction as to kind of how you got into this world and your journey through procurement, and then we can come on to the stuff you've done specifically around services procurement. But I'm interested to know really the story of how it all got started.
Sure. So coming out of undergrad, I had done business economics, also had an interest in languages. So you did a double major in German and business economics. Um, Coming out, I actually started working for a small debt purchasing firm in the financial services company, where I did do their vendor management. They didn't have a formal procurement group, so everything really sat under finance. And I did a vendor management of their attorney network, and then also their outsourced collection agencies. Um, so started off with a few years there, really doing a lot of the analytics, supporting a lot of the sourcing decisions. Actually started into the vendor selection piece in my latter part of my career there with the collection agencies, getting a little bit closer managing them, sourcing. Didn't do a lot of the negotiation at that point. I was really kind of getting my feet wet in that area of procurement, right? Um, Kind of at the end of that stint, I decided I wanted to go back to get my MBA. I went to Georgia Tech, got my MBA there for the focus in operations and finance. Did the full-time program. Coming out of that program, I took a role with Infosys Consulting. Started there as one of their consultants, working up to be a principal. Before I left, I was in the oil and gas industry, managing large-scale, technology implementations, migrations of data, a little bit of PMO work. Switched over my last 2.5, 3 years into the life sciences industry, doing a lot of the management of website content build, digital delivery, email marketing campaigns. Yeah, so we have typical to Infosys Consulting, we have a large offshore delivery model. So I was the on-site, let's call it PM for lack of a better word, that would really take the requirements coming from the business stakeholders, as well as the creative agencies, translate those to really the contract of, this is how we would build that website, so or that email campaign, or the CRM on the back end that needed to collect data. And then just through the entire life cycle of the build of that campaign, the testing, the go live, the hypercare post, and then updates beyond. So I did that for a few years at Infosys. Actually, my first son was born while I was there. I really decided, I don't want to travel every week any longer. I don't want to go multiple times at this point now, because now I'm starting to sell business and work, on some of the client side. So started looking for roles. I liked what I had done at Credigy was the name of the company, where the vendor management aspect, some of the sourcing, the vendor selection. So I started looking for more procurement related roles. Came back to Assurant. I started there as a category manager, worked at Assurant for a few years, really enjoyed the role. Same thing, managed large BPO, negotiations, some financial services negotiations, contracts. Really delved deeper into that category management aspect, as well as the sourcing side. Fast forward a few years, I took a role at Cox Automotive. They had a category manager role over there. So I moved to Cox Automotive. Very similar for a few years. We worked in the BPO space, contact center, both the technology side and the outsourcing side of sourcing. So built kind of the reputation there. Then Cox consolidated. I don't know if you're aware of Cox. They're really
Yeah.
kind of three main companies. They've got their family holding company, which is Cox Enterprises. They've got the cable company, which is Cox Communications, and then they have their automotive business, which is Cox Automotive. Cox Automotive is really kind of an amalgamation of 27, 28 different smaller companies that each have a part of the life cycle of a car post leaving the factory. So if you think of Kelley Blue Book, Auto Trader, Mannheim, those are all Cox Automotive companies.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of people aren't like aware, and that's like the enterprise layer around all of those companies,
I
right?
didn't realize Auto
Um,
Trader were part. I didn't realize Auto Trader were part of that.
yeah, so they've got a CRM, they've got a website development company, dealer.com. They've got, if you are scheduling an appointment with your local dealership, it's usually powered by Xtime, which Xtime is a Cox company. So they literally have they touch something in the life cycle of the car across the entire, all the way to being scrapped. So it's a really cool company. But right at the beginning of COVID, they consolidated support into a supply chain COE for all of those entities, for the cable company, the automotive company, as well as the family holding company. At the time, I had the opportunity to either stay in sourcing or come over into kind of the sourcing operations side, which was managing our MSP VMS, which was about, if you take all three companies combined, was about $800 million in spend. About 120 million of that was staff augmentation. And then the other 650 was services procurement. The program had been in place. It started at Cox Communications in 2007 as a staff aug only. It was primarily staff aug until a few years before I took over. Then they started seeing benefits, of a centralized system. So they were able to have a pilot program with their construction business to really kind of help with accruals, spend visibility, management of the statements of work that come through the system, and that's really where a lot of their services procurement journey started.
Interesting.
So yeah, it has been a lot, right? I mean, the role, it grew to be all of enterprise supply chain programs. So supplier risk rolled up under me, our supplier diversity program, as well as our contract lifecycle management system. So, and then in that time, I was in that role about 5 years, 4.5 years. We grew that program from about 800 million in spend to about 1.6 billion in spend. Right, and then the staff aug portion stayed pretty static. It was typically about 120 million in spend, all the way, up to that 1.6 billion, about 1.5 in services procurement spend.
This is so fantastic because this is what I think it's so important for us to talk about this and for you to really share some of the details, the challenges, how you got started, where the program went to, because there's not many people with that experience who've worked on the successful delivery, and I'm sure there were challenges along the way, but the successful delivery of a genuine services procurement management endeavor and the benefits that drives for the business. You and I have both been to plenty of conferences where we've run roundtables on stuff around services procurement, and you know what it's like. There's so many people sitting around the table that are so far off starting. They don't know it's possible. They don't know the problems that other companies have. They feel insecure about the problems that their company has. They maybe feel they don't have the backing. They maybe think, how would I possibly get sponsorship for this? How would we deliver the change management? What would it actually bring to the business? How do I put a business case together? And I think what I really want to try and do today is mine that knowledge in you, in the fantastic experience you've had in delivering that massive program for Cox Communications, or Cox Enterprises, sorry, let's give the group name. because it's quite rare. And you know what? When you're sat in a round table at an event, a lot of the time it's quite a quick turnaround. And I think there's value in people understanding your journey around this services procurement transformation, because it's, as I say, there are challenges, and they're the same sort of challenges that exist for most businesses. I think it's really interesting when you look at that, and it's not that long ago, but partly due to the size of the organization, but it also partly highlights something that I'm constantly fascinated by, which is that procurement's still quite a young function.
Yeah.
For a lot of organizations, it's kind of procurement has come in later. And okay, an organization needs to get to a certain size to make it really that relevant and impactful. But I think it's just becoming more and more impactful. I was at a dinner in London last night, run by Bloor Research, and it was basically a discussion around AI and the future of work. Super, super interesting. There were like 18 people, CIOs, CEOs, CFOs, CPOs, all sorts of different people from lots of massive companies, debating this and just discussing it around the table with the Bloor research team. And it was fascinating looking at the kind of like the trend that shows that work is moving towards outputs and outcomes, which shifts it more under procurement than necessarily HR, depending on how a company is structured. But also just looking at the use of AI itself, was it one chap there who's a chief procurement officer, and he was kind of saying, you know what, I think procurement are almost in a position to inherit a lot of value and build a lot of importance in organizations, because AI fits so beautifully into how it can bolster that procurement function. So procurement as a function and maybe slightly later to the party, but I just think it's an area that's really growing in maturity and importance. And so from there you went on to category management. What sort of stuff did you start managing in terms of what sort of categories, and how was that transition to the services side at Cox? How did that kind of happen, in the sense that were you obviously with what you were doing on the debt side, that's all services because it's the debt collection agencies, the legal network. What was it? Has it always been services in terms of what you managed, or were there kind of like goods and materials thrown in there along your journey?
No, I've done more of the services journey. I've done very little on the direct materials. Yeah, at Cox Automotive, I was very much on the kind of the technology side, the services, or I guess the SaaS software that supported, whether it be telephony, contact center builds, then also the outsourcing. So if you think of companies, that do the customer care, like Sitel, Alorica, a lot of those companies, was really negotiating large scale agreements with those, running some RFX events to outsource a lot of our contact center software. So, negotiating with NICE, Sutherland as well, Genesis. So it was a mix between some of the technology support as well as the services as well, but none of the really direct. We did, I was not ever purchasing, widgets and products of, when you talk about direct materials.
Yeah, interesting. It's there's it seems that certain types of people are drawn to more kind of services based categories. I feel like there's a level of complexity and um, you know for people that in procurement, some people just really like those kind of direct goods and materials based channels. It really suits them. It's kind of it's very much a solved problem from a technology point of view. It's very lots of cataloging, guided buying, all that sort of stuff. Services, in some organizations, it's like literally like the Wild West. And generally, you see people in services-based categories. The procurement people are typically totally swamped by just the volume of activity that they just can't get their hands around, because it's labor intensive, it's got manual processes, and it's got all those problems that you and I are so familiar with. But also the type of personality of a procurement practitioner who likes the services side. It's not for everyone, is it? Because it's pretty challenging.
But it's not. You're not wrong. I mean, when you think of direct materials, right, you're typically, you're trying to back into what the cost is for them to build it, right? And then all right, what's an acceptable margin on top of that, right? And when you get onto the services side, you know that there's a massive disparity between what the actual cost of that human capital is versus the service that they're providing, right? I mean, you think of just your typical staff aug model versus your services, statement of work model. You staff aug, there's a much smaller margin, right? If I'm getting a technical PM, I can get that resource typically, anywhere from like a 30 to 40% markup of what their actual rate is. But if I go over the services procurement side and you're talking about your Accentures or Infosys, like my company, your markup is completely different, right? And it's typically um, harder to get. Like you've got some industry metrics, but you're not going to have Accenture saying, "Oh yeah, well we pay David Orme $150,000 a year, but we bill him at $300,000 a year for you," right? So there's a level of expertise, and I think access to knowledge as well that you're paying for when you're dealing with services procurement companies. And then it even gets even more complicated and complex, right? When you think about the niche kind of companies that are really providing a service that is not something that's, very typical in the industry, like AI right now, right? I mean, everybody's paying a lot for people that know AI and know it really well.
Yeah, 100%. Those kind of like knowledge IP based transactions, they're a lot harder to tie down than and you're transferring liability. It's a lot harder to tie down than just as you say a staff org type setup. Um, and it was like I say this event I went to last night. It was really interesting listening to Richard from Bloor Research talking about the fact that AI could make a person who's working 5 days a week be able to get the work done in 3 days a week. And like what connotations does that have for GDP versus job creation, things like that. And it's like, well, you could look at it one way or the other. You could look at it as um, you need less of that person doing that work, or you could look at it as that person can be more productive and actually you can get more work done. And actually where this moves is towards what's the thing you're trying to do rather than just looking at work in this binary way of just looking at it as just time spent. I found that quite fascinating, but it also ties into the fact that you've got all the liability tied in with regards to these service providers. They're providing people doing work, but they're also providing background in intellectual property, and they are taking liability for the delivery of it. So it's a completely different setup to that kind of staff org scenario. And one of the things that strikes me about what you were saying earlier is just the relative size of within Cox of the services procurement element of how they're getting work done versus the staff org program. I mean, 120 million annual turnover in a staff org program is still pretty decent. But when you're getting to the point that the program's 1.6 billion per year, and still 120 million of that is staff augmentation, that just shows the relative size of those two components of how that organization is getting work done. It's not always going to be the exact same kind of multiplier in every company, but as you and I know, it's on average, it's easily 6 times. In most cases, I see it more like kind of 10 times the size. I think maybe a lot of people don't actually realize that.
Well, and you're not wrong, right? I mean, if you think about it, the staff oxide is the visible workforce, right? Typically, right? Because the manager's directly managing it, so they know they've got it. They're issuing a laptop a lot of the times, giving access. When you look at your services procurement, if it's not T&M and it's outcome driven, you don't often know how many resources are actually working on that, right? Or if they don't name the roles that are going to be doing it or the number of folks within the statement of work, you don't know if it took 10 people to give you that $1 million output or if it took two. And that's one of the things that we did at Cox is we try to put named resources in every single one of our statements of work. And just from a data collection perspective, we wanted a rate associated with that person. Even though it wasn't time and material, we wanted to be able to say, okay, well, we've got 5 people Scrum team of 5 folks where they're the Scrum Master is making X, these folks are supposed to be making Y, and it depending on the company, Cox Automotive did this more closely with it. They would tie the expected outcome to what they thought the amount should be, even though they weren't tracking the time. But they would do analysis to say, hey, are we getting the value for what we think we're paying for? Right? This company, let's call it, Tom Jones Consulting is telling us that they're paying their resources X, Y, and Z, and we're paying for, like I said, $1 million output. Do we think that we actually got the value for the $1 million output? So they would do some of that reverse engineering, try to do some of that reverse engineering on the consulting side as well.
So that's quite interesting because what effectively you're doing there is you're using the assumed rates almost like as a proxy for comparison against a staff org methodology. So
Yep.
effectively, I mean, ultimately that's what it comes down to, isn't it? The organization has various different ways of getting work done. They can use
Yep.
their perm employees to get work done. They can use contract or temp labor, or they can outsource it. Um, so, but making comparisons across those to be able to say what's the best way to get this work done, which you and I, I know you guys are doing some cool stuff around triage at the moment. It's an area that you and I are very familiar with, where an organization starts with a piece of work they need to do, and then they've got to work out what's the most effective way to do it and what's the
Right.
compliant route that this should be. But it's interesting because I think being able to make comparisons across the different workforce delivery models is almost like the holy grail, really, isn't it?
It's hard, right? Because, I mean, like we were just talking about, most of your services procurement, they just say, all right, I need this outcome. They don't worry about what's in, kind of underneath it. And I don't disagree with you. We are moving more to outcome based from a services procurement delivery, but I also feel like there's kind of an aspect of total cost of ownership that's coming into it, right? And if you don't understand like the should cost of what those resources are doing to make that widget, you can't really say, all right, well, I should have a full-time employee doing this, or I should have someone from staff aug do this, right? You can't really do that analysis very effectively if you don't know that I had 5 resources tied to this, working on this deliverable.
Yeah, and I think, it also highlights the fact that, you've got some finance in your background and you've got that analytical side to your background. And it's like, you know, it's not necessarily like you say, every statement of work is going to be different. And there's IP tied up in it, there's liability tied up in it. So it's more than just the hours that the
Right.
people and their time that they're putting into it. But why not try and put some numbers around it? Why not try and do some calculations? Because it's all just and we'll come on to the business case side of it later, but it's all just part of how that business should be running the way it does work. So I think, it absolutely makes sense where people have this stuff organized and they can see it, they can start to apply some logic to it to say, well, if we do that this way, it's going to cost us this as a lump sum for delivery. If we did it via staff org, we reckon it's going to take this many people, this many weeks, or whatever it might be. You can start making some comparisons and assumptions around it, which is, this is the world is driven by data. But the fact that you had the data on that, you had that information, and you had the clarity and the visibility on those engagements allowed you to start playing around with the numbers on that. So I think although it's not an exact science and it is about outputs and outcomes, you can definitely apply some financial logic to it to try and drill into it a bit more effectively, which for a lot of firms would be a huge leap forward for them.
Well, absolutely, right. And then even just outside of the financial aspect of it, you think about kind of the risk aspect, right? Who has access to your buildings? Who's coming in, right? And if you don't have those resources, if you're not tracking them in system, we've got 5 visitor badges we issued today. Well, to whom? Is there really an easy way to track that versus, all right, well, we know, these 10 resources from Accenture are working on this project through the end of the year, or, through June, we know those 10 resources are coming in. They have access. So it's broader, right? It was twofold, right? It was getting access to the data, the types of roles, so we have more information, but then also managing the people themselves of knowing who's in our building, right? Like if you think of, all right, well, if there's an emergency, we've got to make sure we can get everybody out. Well, who badged in today? Well, if there is a random visitor badge that we aren't aware of and no contact to it, we've got to figure out now that we've got how to get those folks out and how to find them. So
Cyber security as well, such a huge
yeah.
area, the whole kind of infosec, who's got access to the systems, access to the building, etc. It's massively important. Um, and you and I have both been in situations where you're listening to a very senior C-suite board member of an organization being very shocked because they've asked somebody, chief procurement officer or head of contingent workforce or head of HR, whoever it might be, head of talent acquisition, how many people have we got badging into our business? How many people have we got on our systems who are not employees? We think it's 5,000, but hang on, how come you're telling me it's 25,000? So, it happens all the time, doesn't it?
Well, it's kind of an invisible workforce, right? And I mean, I saw one stat that said roughly 60% of an organization is not full-time employees, right? Or the spend, right? Of kind of the spend that they're doing is on third-party resources that aren't your own employee. And if you look at some of the stuff that SIA's put out, they estimate roughly 20% of your actual workforce, 21% of your actual workforce is not a full-time employee. And of that 21%, I think you and I were talking about this, 2 to 3% of that makeup is really your staff aug and your ICs, your independent contractors, right? And the rest of that is your services procurement, your workforce. And if you're trying to track your total workforce and you're not running that services procurement through a vendor management system, or I mean, typically you'll have it going through Oracle, so you'll have access, or Oracle or whatever your pay system is, so you have access to kind of spend data, but you don't have anything granular. You don't know what the actual people coming in and out of your office are, or who has access to what. So it's a larger chunk than I feel like people recognize.
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of it slips through the cracks a little bit as well because it's like a diffusion of responsibility where if you take services procurement broadly, some of it's going to be in a bit of a grey area that kind of, does it sit under HR, talent acquisition, contingent workforce, right through to, big IT outsourced projects that absolutely sit under procurement. So what I have definitely observed in the market is that the something that's really starting to grow now is the idea that someone needs to take ownership of services procurement as a channel. And it's a super important channel that is not visible effectively for a lot of companies, and it's not well managed for the vast majority of companies. So the fact that within your program, that at Cox, that was such a big percentage of the spend that was going through it, I think just underlines that really. So just so that I understand with regards to the program at Cox, so they basically had an MSP with a vendor management system to manage the contingent worker side of it. That was already up and running. You've got 120 million a year going through the staff augmentation side of it. Very much a solved problem. Vendor management systems to manage contingent workers have been around for 20 plus years. The MSPs, there's a very mature service offering around that. So they'd already started looking at the SOW side of it. Um, and when you came into it, what was the kind of level of sophistication around that services procurement? Was it something that was intentionally brought into the program, or was it something that had kind of like leaked into the program because it just kind of sat in an adjacent space?
Um, Initially, it was something that was, let's say, it was intentional due to the need for spend visibility, right, and tracking accruals, more closely, right. I think one of the issues they had, especially from and you'll see this across any company that's not leveraging an MSP, but everybody gets busy, right? So your hiring manager is responsible for creating POs in the system. It's typically not done by procurement, right? Like procurement typically will take the contract. Depending on the maturity of your organization, they either get the contract after your business has already negotiated it, so they're kind of just checking to make sure there's nothing crazy, or they're a more active partner. They do the negotiation, can help with the vendor selection if it's an RFP, but then they sign it, and often it goes straight back to that business stakeholder, right? And then that business stakeholder has to open up a PO, has to do all of the extra work, onboarding the resources, open all of those requests. So there's a transactional element post supply chain that you're dependent on whoever is managing the business. And if you've got a guy who's managing 20 different statement of works that are coming through, and he's got to approve all of these invoices that are coming across, all of these time and materials, or reviewing milestones, things get lost, right? They don't get approved on time, right? And if you don't have a finance manager on your business finance kind of pushing and tracking, or you don't have someone from the business, from the supplier side saying, hey, where's my money? Which happens often, right? Yeah, I mean, it is kind of shocking how much a supplier will just be doing the work, and then the milestone payments don't come, but they don't find out until at year end, and they're like, oh, well, they owe me $500,000. They didn't respond, they didn't approve these invoices. So it's like, so it's on both sides, right? There's really nobody want that process, right? And if you don't have a manager that's diligent, it falls behind, and not through any means other than they are so bogged down with work, they just don't even think about it.
Yeah,
And that's the beauty of kind of the MSP, is they've got those controls in place and a vendor management system. It sends notifications, there's reporting, and that's kind of how it grew at Cox. Is it's like, well, we need to get a better handle on the controls that don't really exist right now, and we need to move them into a place where it becomes more streamlined, more centralized. And if you think from an MSP perspective, just the cost of that management is significantly cheaper than if you had to hire your own internal team, or augment your finance team to get 10 resources to just manage $1 billion in spend coming through.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really interesting what you mentioned about the supplier side of it. Made me chuckle really, because we've seen that. We've seen situations within Zivio where you've got an organization engaging with a big supply chain, and some of those suppliers, there's just stuff sitting there that they just haven't billed for. They've just kind of like forgotten to bill it. And I think that's, like you say, that's the beauty of capturing these things within a system. Suddenly this stuff becomes visible. Oh, that milestone's overdue. Oh, that invoice hasn't been created and the milestone's been completed. That's an action that needs to take place. But like you say, there's so much to it, and services procurement is so fluid that for a lot of organizations, this stuff is just in a giant haystack of confusion, really, isn't it?
It is, right? And if you think about it, it becomes even more complex when you start looking across, the different business units, the different functions, because everybody's managing their budgets, right? And so that was one of the biggest challenges we had. It wasn't a mandated program. So how do you get the services procurement inside the system when you're dealing with personalities, right? I mean, that's really what it is at the end of the day. People don't want to lose control or perceived control, right? If they are putting it in the vendor management system. I mean, that was one of the biggest battles I feel like we had is, well, I'm not going to have access to my supplier anymore, or I'm not going to be able to go in and have that relationship. And it's like, well, no, the MSP isn't taking that supplier relationship away from you. What they're doing is they're managing the tactical elements of that supplier relationship to make sure, one, the supplier is performing, that they're doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, that they're uploading their invoices, they're handling escalations. Then they're also on the flip side, making sure that you're approving in a timely manner, right? I mean, most large organizations have either early pay discount clauses or rebate clauses, right? Where if and they're all tied to paying your suppliers on time, right? Or within that time frame. And if you don't, like if an invoice gets submitted and it goes past the net 45 or net 30 that you've negotiated, typically you can't include that invoice in the tally of your rebate at year end that's coming back from that supplier. So there's a lot of ways you can talk to your internal stakeholders to really say, look, these are the things we're doing. What are your bigger concerns, right? What are you really fighting against, right? Why don't you want this to happen? And honestly, sometimes it boils down to I don't want my budget to shrink, right? Like I want to spend money on what I want to. I have a budget, and there's a lot of pressure within organizations to spend all of your budget, or they reduce it, right? And that visibility that a MSP and VMS brings really kind of threatens that, right? So it calls into question that, well, I've got $2 million a year that I spend in my budget that we estimated for project planning. I've only spent 1.4. Well, I've got to figure out how to spend that other 600,000 before year end, or else they're going to reduce my budget to 1.5 next year.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a kind of, I feel like these days that it feels like an old school mentality. It absolutely is there. And you know, if you think about that from like the CEO's point of view, they're going to be thinking, don't spend money you don't need to spend. Just get the stuff done, you know, and it comes back to this whole thing of services procurement is one of the really important ways that organizations get things done. And they've got to be good at getting things done. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to take their product or service to market in a way that means they're competitive. And for me, it's all about that ability to compete in the market, the ability to be effective. And so I think, you know, the days of people just sort of thinking, well, I can get away with just keeping my 2 million a year budget because there's not enough scrutiny on it. You know, if companies can afford to waste money, then good luck to them. But what the market we're in now, the conditions, the speed of change, um, the efficiencies that certainly like, you know, these business up and coming businesses that are highly tech enabled, you know, there's not carrying any wastage, they're not legacy, they haven't got the big legacy of some of the bigger established organizations where these practices are quite common. You know, these companies that don't take a forward-thinking approach, they're going to get left behind. And it's a very important point that you raise. Although I can kind of say, well, you know, the CEO is not going to like that approach. That is definitely the attitude of a lot of people in a lot of companies. And I'd imagine for people that might have sat on a round table with you or I at one of the contingent workforce you know, summit events and things like that, a lot of people worry about this. So like you say, the stakeholders, there's going to be resistance to coming into a program. And if it's not mandated, which for a lot of companies they'd say culturally we don't mandate stuff, um, that's got to feel like a mountain to climb for a lot of people. So you're controlling the program, you can see it totally makes sense. How did you approach those interactions? How did you arrange to speak to people? How did you kind of how did you get to the root cause of that, and how did you move it forward?
Yeah, so a lot of it's very similar to sourcing, right? It's like kind of category management. And if you think about, so as a sourcing category leader, I took the view of more of the long game, right? You need to build a relationship, right? Because sourcing wasn't mandated at any company I've been at. It's using sourcing wasn't mandated. So it's about building that relationship and proving your value, right? So if I go into a meeting and I don't understand the business need and what they're trying to solve, I can say all day long, oh, well, you know, sourcing, you know, using Twilio versus bandwidth is going to save you know, $5 million. They're going to be like, well, we don't care about $5 million. We care about the service that we're trying to provide. Will the $5 million pay for it, right? So you've got to really understand what is the outcome. It's not necessarily the cost savings should be an output of what you're doing, right? It shouldn't be the reason why. You know, procurement, finance, your CFO, your CPOs, they're very concerned about reducing costs, right? Especially in procurement because it's 100% save versus like on the sales side. If you sell $1 million, well, you're really only making about $200,000 more, right? Or you know, however much it is. Um, so it's really building that relationship and having that conversation and say, okay, well, what are you trying to solve for? What does that business need? And how do I enable it, right? And are there ways to influence and do that through our category sourcing, through preferred suppliers that we already have, or is this potentially an RFX event that we need to have because you're talking about, you know, a $5 million purchase? Do we necessarily want to use a legacy provider that we've been using who has okay performance, but is hit or miss, right? So, so that was the take I took with growing the program. One, you do your typical, let me pull everything out of our financial system to see what is our discretionary spend versus non-discretionary, what's actually already being captured within the system, where do we have large user groups that are already, one, potentially using the vendor management for the MSP or the VMS for other services, so like staff augmentation, but they're not using it for services procurement. So really identifying those areas and then just reaching out. Honestly, I like people want to talk. They want to talk about what they're doing. They want to tell you about what they're doing, right? So part of it is probably company culture. It's very open company culture of like, hey, reach out, support, learn more about each other, the company. So, that's one of the things I did at Cox is it's just like did a roadshow one of what our services are, just in general across our higher spend category areas and those leaders. And then just started really diving into what are the problems you're solving here? What are you trying to, you've got, as a category across 20 suppliers, you've got $100 million in spend. What is your thought process of not bringing it into the system, right? Because from a systemic purpose, we can give you the visibility, we can give you the granularity of this, of the spend, the people, the tracking. We take all of that transactional burden off of you, right? So you could focus on the strategic. You don't have to do POs anymore, right? We're a white glove MSP, VMS provider. They will come in, they will create the POs. You would just have to come in, do the final approvals, right? So is really diving into the, just dissecting what is their fear. And a big portion of it was the control that I mentioned earlier. Then there was the fear that costs were going to go up. That was one of the biggest fears. Well, my budget's already so lean. If we put it through the VMS, they're going to charge me more. And I'm like, well, no, this is what our procurement team is for, right? Like this is why our procurement function exists. Is we make sure that doesn't happen, so that they're not passing any cost back to you. Part of the conversation is also with the suppliers that say, let's say it's a new supplier that doesn't go through the VMS, talking about the benefits to them as well going through, because there aren't just benefits of us as stakeholders going through. There's also supplier benefits, right? Same thing. They get paid in a timely manner. Any escalations are resolved pretty much immediately, right? Any concerns. So they're not waiting on that that business stakeholder to review and approve. They've got a system in place that's ensuring that, one, they're invoicing timely, that they're processing their invoice or getting their time in, and then also making sure that it is flowing through that entire end-to-end process quickly.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you talk about the kind of the fear side of it and the process side of it.
Yeah.
It all comes down to change, really, doesn't it? It's, humans are wired to be wary of change. Um, but I think you've touched on a point that I've heard quite a few kind of procurement visionaries, I would call them, people who are very kind of, future focused and progressive in the procurement function. One of the big things, as you mentioned, that many people mention is understand the business. Procurement has to really understand the strategy of the business and where it's trying to go, because then you can operate as a facilitator. So you're then in the business saying, look, to the stakeholder, what is it you need to do? And we were talking earlier about people being concerned about their budgets. Ultimately, it's not a vanity metric. They're thinking, I need to get my work done. I need to have the money to be able to do the things I need to do. So there is the right sort of intention is behind that concern. But actually understanding the business, understanding the stakeholder, what they need to do, that is all about making the business more effective and allowing that business to compete in the market, and be successful against its competitors. So all of these things, like you say, building that relationship and having that conversation, they open up all these benefits, which initially there's resistance to. And as I say, if I think back to sitting on a kind of round table looking at where's services procurement now and where's it going in the future, what's holding the market back, these are all the things that come up, aren't they? People are in procurement, either they don't feel empowered or they don't feel they've got the business case or the drivers. But one of the big things that they feel is holding them back is just like, how the hell am I going to get the organization to change? So just what was that journey like in terms of, let's think back to some, you don't have to, let's not name any names, but if you think about some of the stakeholders that were really challenged this and were really against it to start with, what kind of brought them round? How did you get them over the hurdle?
Yeah, so a lot of it really it boiled down to small proof of concepts in
Right.
some cases, um, which we're fortunate, right? I mean, if you already have a vendor management system in place, it makes it easier to say, hey, let's run a one SOW through, right? If you don't have something like a VMS in place or like Zivio, like an SPS, that becomes a more difficult conversation. Um, but no, like for me, it was very much of you talking to the fear, saying, okay, your fear is lack of control of the supplier. You think that the MSP is going to control it. Not the case. And here's why. Here's what the MSP does. They don't take the actual strategic management conversations that you're having. They enable those through just the tracking of work that you're having. They're able to report on it. Here's examples. Leveraged existing business units, right? So I had the benefit of being across three large corporate entities, right, that were all falling under Cox Enterprises. Well, similar businesses, right? All right, well, look, here at Cox Communications, the tech team is using them for these services, right? So Cox Automotive, look, we can very much say, your fear is prices will go up. Well, look over here. No, we actually were able to, run an RFP from a procurement standpoint, prices went down, right? And you could even leverage these same prices we have because we're now centralized into a COE. Or if you want to select your own suppliers, we can do a very similar thing. That the percentage, because it was a supplier funded model, does not get passed back to you, right? And here's the kind of the proof that we can show that it's already being done on this side. That was actually one of the bigger concerns is that, well, your percent fee is going to get, they're just going to increase my cost by that percent. So we were able to really address that concern just with existing examples within the program. But then the second piece was a lot of it was that control. Like we're going to lose control of the suppliers, and we won't have that direct relationship. And we were able to show, the MSP actually, from a strategic perspective, does not manage those suppliers. Your strategic suppliers are still your strategic suppliers. Like if we wanted to build the function out for the MSP to do that, we could, but that wasn't the direction we took. Our MSP was more of an enabling function. We also had a sourcing team that we built to help on the indirect sourcing side as well. So we had a team of about 8 to 9 people that were actually doing negotiations on our behalf. But it wasn't the vendor management piece, right? Like the strategic management of the vendors. It was just that tactical management.
Yeah, I think the the idea of having proof of concepts, the idea of using examples, you can't argue with the data. You can't argue with the evidence, can you? And I think, you and I have spoken about this before, but in terms of where a lot of people, a lot of procurement people and a lot of companies where they are in the market in terms of trying to address services procurement, just feels like a mountain to climb. And one of the things that I know certainly you and I are very keen to facilitate in the market is just to help people take that first step, to help people get things moving, because it is hard to convince the naysayers. And if you're, trying to roll this out, partly depends what the business drivers are, but and whether it's mandated, etc. But even if it is mandated, you've still got to get people to adopt the program, adopt the technology, and follow the processes. But I think that's really interesting how you used the examples, and it sounds like you kind of rolled it out almost like it was a step-by-step rollout. It wasn't just a bam, here we go.
Oh, absolutely. It was targeted, right? We would target, ones, we'll call them the easy wins, right? The low hanging fruit, those that had a lot of complexity that could be simplified within a vendor management system. Finance was also, we very closely with our ancillary supporting functions, so finance as well and corporate security. So if there were large pockets where there were resources that were being untracked, it becomes part of a double header, right? It's like a risk conversation where security saying, hey, from a risk perspective, we need these people into the vendor management system. And then it comes from a finance perspective saying, hey, yeah, we need to be able to track accruals. We need to be able to, make sure we're making timely payments. We need to be able to make sure we're leveraging our rebates and discounts. And then from my side, it was the coming in and saying, look, we do all of that for you. You would be doing this yourself if you were doing it outside of the vendor management system, right? We will be taking all of that transactional work, the onboarding, offboarding resources, and also providing you that visibility, that level of visibility into all of this data and information that you don't currently have, right? Or if you do have it, you may be tracking it in an Excel spreadsheet, right? Or somewhere, that is not automated, that doesn't come to you easily.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just going back to something else you said earlier about people they worry about the control side of it, but they also worried about costs going up. I find that quite interesting because I'd say there's a fairly good argument to say that if you bring a statement of work under the control and process of a system and a proper program, the visibility you're going to have over it and the likelihood that you're more likely to maybe take it through a competitive bid process. The supplier knows they're under proper scrutiny. You have visibility over change control. You can see the lifetime of the project. You can maybe see performance of the supplier, quality against alongside the kind of quantitative metrics. I'd say there's a pretty good argument that costs might actually even go down.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. You talk about, I mean, change control reporting was something that we didn't have that we finally were able to institute my last year there. I, you talk about, yeah, especially with your consulting companies, like I said, I was one. So you keep your scopes not vague, but you keep them enough to where you're like, all right, well, that's out of scope, so we need to change order it, right? So it becomes kind of a cat and mouse game between procurement and your business, honestly, because business is like, well, yeah, just do the change order, we want to get it done. Procurement's like, oh no, look at the contract, they should be doing this. um and if procurement doesn't have the level of control and visibility into it, your business is going to win every single time, right? They're going to come back and say, well, we need to get the work done, to your point, right? We have to have the work done, so we need to add this in. And that's where one as an MSP becomes an enabling function, but then procurement as well, is it's like, you can validate those statements of work as they come in. You can review them. You could look at them and say, oh yeah, well, this is outcome based, but these deliverables don't really, it's not a deliverable. Right? It's not specific. It's not bound to a certain amount of time. So how would we even hold somebody accountable for this if you as a manager didn't agree to this, right? If you didn't think that this outcome was done. So you're not wrong. Like the visibility that the manager themselves gets into the spend, yeah, they don't see it until they have to pay it at year end. They're like, oh, I exceeded my budget by 50%. Well, why? I had 3 change orders that we didn't budget for. Well, why didn't you budget for them? Was it poor scoping up front? Was it, it forces you to look into all of those questions and really understand, why. And if you've got something like the MSP VMS set up, you can delve into that information. You can go into that data easily, whereas it's a manual process, right? If you don't.
Yeah, I mean, for any organization trying to look back through scanned, signed PDF statements of work, good luck with that. I mean, I've had conversations with CPOs where they've sort of said the difficult conversation came to them where their CFO said, what did we do? What did we do with X supplier last year? Did they do a good job? And it's like, well, I know how much we spent with them. It's just pull an AP report. But actually, in terms of the projects, and whether they did a good job. Were they on time, on budget? Did they have cost overruns? Was it a good piece of work? Did it impact the business? It's an absolute nightmare to try and have to go back through that if, as you say, it's not captured within a program and ultimately captured digitally within some sort of system where you can just line it up and look at the data. Um, so just going back to something else that I know for a lot of people is a real big issue around this. You might get somebody who's sitting in procurement or sitting in HR and talent or contingent workforce type function, looking at their business and saying, we've got our kind of direct goods and materials procurements well sorted. That's looking good. We've got the way that we hire people, the way that we manage contractors and temps, it's all buttoned up. But we've got these statements of work that are just a black hole. For a lot of organizations, I think wrongly, there will be an assumption of like, well, we've always done it like that, and we've managed so far. It's manual process on Excel spreadsheets. It's all kind of not properly tracked, but it's the way we've always done it. In terms of people trying to understand how they can get over that barrier, it comes down to the key drivers. And we've discussed this many times in terms of the different drivers different organizations may have. But just so people can understand how this moved in Cox, and you can see all the benefits that have come out of doing it. It's kind of a no-brainer when it comes down to it. You're spending $1 billion a year on something, over $1 billion a year. You want to kind of know what you're getting for it and what's happening, and you want it organized. But it sounds like one of the key drivers was actually a drive around compliance.
So it was, right. So it depends, and this is why I said it. It really goes into understanding the business, right, and what their drivers are. We had on the auto side, we had a large portion of our business that was failing audits, honestly, because they didn't have, they were beholden to reporting to financial services companies because of agreements we had with their agreements, and they couldn't report everything that was coming in and out of, like, where everybody was at any given time. So a workforce issue of like who had access to what. And I say failing audits, like they were scoring lower than they should have. So that was one of the kind of the areas where we partnered with corporate security, saying, okay, look, this is the driver. They were going to buy a $300,000 system to onboard and offboard resources outside of the vendor management system. And we're like, why would you do that? We have a system already in place. We already have the mechanism in place, the payment, the approval, onboarding, offboarding mechanisms. Let's just leverage the vendor management system. So it became more of a resource tracking play, right, versus your traditional services procurement. And for me, that is an easy place to start, right? I mean, it's like you get 1% better every day. Kind of that methodology. You get somebody into the system, they start tracking the resources. You have them put in the rates. You can't really track spend, but you can track rate, role type, everything else. And your business starts looking at that, and they're like, wait, I have this visibility now into this workforce that I never had before. What more can we do? So we were able to do it just partnering with corporate security. We were able to expand compliance as well. Like, right, there's new laws coming across, just in the US as well, like that are becoming very similar to GDPR, like in California, in Massachusetts, just being able to track resources. So that helped drive it as well. Cost savings typically can become a driver, but it's usually one of the last drivers. Honestly, like the visibility, the management of the workforce, just the management of the freeing up of time to your point earlier, the dinner you were having. A lot of the conversation is look, you're able to free up probably 20 to 30% of a manager's time that they spend on a weekly basis managing these agreements, managing these resources, the approving, the onboarding, offboarding, that now will be done in a vendor management system. They'll take care of the reporting. They take care of everything that manager needs from a transactional basis just to manage that statement of work.
So within the case of your journey at Cox, who were the key sponsors? Now, I understand obviously that the contingent, the overarching kind of staff org program was already in place. They'd already started kind of scratching the surface of the statement of work, the services procurement side of it. But if you look behind the scenes at a senior level, who were the key sponsors of this?
So our key sponsor originally was the CFO at Cox Communications, right? So that was 20 years ago, and then as the program evolved, procurement became the ultimate sponsor. Excuse me. So it was really, it started to be driven by procurement, right? And it was owned wholly by procurement. Um, the last few years, HR was becoming more involved from a staff augmentation side, from the total talent workforce play, with Workday and trying to make sure all resources are tracked back up through kind of that hierarchy. So it became more of a partnership in that area, but that was specific to just the staff aug business. But the services procurement um, was always a procurement sponsored program, and it was driven in partnership by my role with my direct procurement leads, right? So our directors of procurement, my VP of procurement, and then the business, right? I honestly was going into the business. There wasn't a specific sponsor within the different business units. It was more just influence, trying to bring them into the program and get advocates, right? Get change advocates.
Yeah, very interesting. I've seen the approach before where, from a change management perspective, the people that are trying to make the change will sometimes try and tackle some of the people that are most resistant to change early on. Was that part of the approach? Because there's always going to be the people that kind of shout loudest about, oh, this is not going to work and why I don't like it. But I
Absolutely. Yeah, I was gonna say absolutely. Like it's a journey, right? Like I'll tell you, there's parts of our business, the auctions, that still to this day, I mean, I have put together. There was one business case before me. I put together two separate business cases. And there's probably thousands of resources that go through those on a daily basis. And they're managed both on the staff aug side and the services procurement side, because they'll bring in, temp drivers for the auctions and everything else. So it's a journey, right? And it's one of those where you try to win by influence. You try to show by example, right? You bring in other parts of the businesses to have that conversation. Um, and they're relooking at it again right now. I mean, a lot of it depends on the sponsor that you have internally. Um, one of the easy wins that we had at Cox Enterprises was just a transfer from Cox Communications that used our services, moved into a new role over in the company over there, and they said, "Well, why are we doing this in Smartsheet? Why aren't we doing this in the vendor management system?" So a lot of it is that influence and being able to build your credibility through what you're already doing and the good performance.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So if you look at where Cox started out and where they got to, if you had to kind of define why the business was better off where it ended up as to where it started with this, and what the kind of key wins were, are there any particular metrics that you would put around that, or how would you kind of describe those key wins as the business capability when it was mature, when you moved on, compared to kind of before they actually ran that program?
Yeah, so visibility into spend is a massive win. Uh, One of the big issues that they had were accruals, right? You've got a lot of business running through Oracle that wasn't being tracked accurately, right? Or businesses weren't uploading their invoices. So at year end, you'd have a massive rush of hundreds of millions of dollars potentially that all of a sudden came in, and the business is like, well, where did all of this come from? We weren't planning for this. So one, just from a financial aspect, one of our biggest wins was getting finance support, right? Saying, oh, well, we actually have full visibility. We try to drive things from Oracle as their system out of Oracle into the vendor management system because we know the controls are in place and they're being monitored, they're being reported on. Whereas if it's through Oracle, they had to try to do it, and they didn't have the bandwidth to do it, and they didn't have the controls in place to really say, our managers are approving it in a timely manner, that all the POs are put in, like if it was signed, if an agreement was signed, and then it was on the manager to put it in, you know, they it was a hope, a wish, and a prayer, right? Because it wasn't automatically done. Whereas if that spend's already going through the VMS, as soon as it was signed by procurement, immediately gets entered into the VMS, right? Versus if it was being managed through Oracle via PO. And I imagine that's probably very similar in a lot of organizations, right? Where you've got Coupa or Ariba, and it's really just you've got the buy side, and you don't really have anything beyond that in the tracking of the resources or anything else. So, I would say that visibility into your spend is huge. It gives you the granularity of the reporting that you're able to give to your business at year end. Not necessarily year end, probably September when they start their planning cycle for the budget for the next year, because they use all of that information as part of what should our budget be, right? So it was always an easier conversation when for the business, when they're like, oh, I've got access to this data, I already have it, I don't have to try to pull it, and I can already tell you, these are the projects that we've got that are open, that are still going to be coming through next year, so we could plan from an accrual purpose. Versus the business units that did not, they didn't have that as good control on their budgets. So that's an easy win there, that I would say is a good indicator of a healthy, mature program, is being able to just do planning and budgeting accurately. And honestly, you look at KPIs, cost savings always are huge, right? If you're sitting in procurement or finance, so there are always targets. I mean, that's always going to be one of the biggest targets for most procurement organizations is they're given their savings target that they have to negotiate every year. So that visibility and that tracking and that category management that you're able to do when you have that visibility into the spend, just enables your procurement function and finance function infinitely better than you would otherwise, right? Because if you're pulling data from Oracle, you don't have that granular level data to really say, all right, well, I can't tell you what the hourly rates are for these folks, so I don't know if what we're paying for these resources is even adequate, right? Or if we're managing to our rate cards, so they just don't have that level of information.
Yeah, and it always makes me think, if you don't have this information, if you aren't managing things in an organized way, how can you be strategic as an organization? And you're talking about over $1 billion a year in spend. One of the when you talk to people who recognize that there's a big problem, or they're getting into the conversation, they're thinking, wow, well, I know we've got a big problem here, and they just think, I don't know how we're going to get started, I don't know how we're going to get what the drivers are going to be, I don't know how we're going to get the buy-in, build the business case, get the sponsorship, the support at exec level. If you look at what you and the team achieved, and the MSP partner achieved at Cox, I always like to do a bit of an exercise where I sort of go, well, if you took that business back to what it was doing before they had this program right now, what would be the negative impacts on that business? And when you look at what you
Cost, I mean, right there, like cost, you wouldn't have visibility. How do you plan, right? Like, I mean,
risk,
the risk, like it's astronomical, right? And people, I mean, I'll be candid. Like, we had a C-suite leader come and say to my VP of procurement, I want a business case. Why, what's the value of going through the vendor management system versus me having my own people do it? I didn't even have to get into the ancillary costs of, oh, well, you've got to, if we're going to manage the management system or a system of our own, what's the cost, the upkeep, who's going to manage it, or the integrations, who's going to make sure those are working. Just the people cost alone that you get from an MSP significantly outweighs, and forget the fact that we were supplier funded, which made this a very fun conversation to begin with. But just the people cost, right, of how many people you had to work. If you think about a $1.6 billion program, we had roughly 6 to 8 people on the services or on the staff augmentation side. Then we had like our professional services, then we broke it up into construction services as well. And we had about 6 to 8 people dedicated managing those different buckets. Then you had your people that were supplier onboarding, offboarding, which were partially COE resources on the MSP side, right? So not fully dedicated, but partially dedicated. We had an analytics team that was fully dedicated from an MSP side to support any requests, data, build outs of dashboards, coming across. An offshore team as well that did some support, for around the clock, around the sun work. Just from a people standpoint, you're looking at 35 plus people that are easily supporting this program that you now have to pay for, or you have to do without. Right? Like you have to either put that burden back on your internal employees. So now you have to figure out how are you going to allocate, who's managing the finance approvals, who's managing the actual resources, who's managing the onboarding, offboarding, who's managing the collection of certifications of insurance, so the risk management. So it was actually fairly simple to come back and say, look, here's what it's going to cost. I can go deeper, but if not, just from a people perspective, this is what it would cost us to come back and manage this program ourselves. It's interesting because I've seen SIAs reporting on this, like a little bit of a trend to going back to internal management of your CW programs, and I look at that and I'm like, I feel like it must be in small to medium size firms, because from a large firm perspective, if you're managing a significant amount of spend, the offset of cost and what you're going to have to now dedicate to analytics, to other just like kind of, I call third-party spend that's going to come in and actually manage that for you on that's in addition to what you would be doing, is just astronomical. So I just don't know. I don't see how they're finding that feasibility in bringing it back in-house.
Well, I would imagine that where there is feasibility, possibly it's in more kind of medium-sized organizations, not the giant enterprises. But also, I would bet my bottom dollar that it's not heavily services procurement focused, which is where the big growth area, because the complexity, if you look at contingent workforce management, it is more commoditized, it is more mature from a technology perspective, from a service perspective. You've got companies who are in their kind of third, fourth, fifth generation of running these programs. Services procurement is in the very early days compared to contingent
Yeah.
workforce. So I would definitely say that would be a differentiator as well. But just listening to you talking about the changes that were made and the value that it drove within Cox, it's pretty clear to see that if you just suddenly say, okay, I'm going to wave a magic wand and turn everything back to how it was, it would basically have a disastrous impact on the business from a cost perspective, a risk perspective, an operational perspective, supplier relationships, all these things. I find that a fascinating way to look at it when people are saying it's really hard to get started. When you look at a mature program and go, well, if you took all that away, you'd see where the value is pretty quickly.
Yeah, all the controls are now gone, right? I mean, I cannot tell you how many battles we had with business leaders, and not that I fault suppliers for doing this, but the suppliers are trying to, maximize their value, right? They're trying to maximize their cost. And I cannot tell you how often we had the conversation of, well, I agreed to do, $10 more per rate, just because per hour, because we need to, the business or the supplier came in and said, oh, we're getting this resource, they've been doing this, we need to up it for another $10. And I'm like, well, that's not the rate card. It's not what's agreed upon, and they know the process, right? So we've had to push back on so many. I mean, that's one of the values of the MSP, in my opinion, is they're the kind of that gatekeeper as those initial SOWs come in. Because often the business will say, we'll have a lot of those commercial conversations up front, with the suppliers, and then they send a request. They're like, "Oh, we've agreed to this," and we're like, "Well, no, procurement hasn't agreed to this as a function, right?" So if you don't have that gatekeeper, right, or if you don't have that visibility into just change orders, like we talked about earlier, like that cost alone just magnifies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming in and taking the time to chat through this stuff. I really do think it's so important for people to be able to listen and hear you talk about the challenges that you faced with this and how it started, where it's got to now. Um, I'm really looking forward to getting back together for another conversation to talk about all the really cool, exciting stuff you're now doing within Pontoon, which is a whole nother journey in another episode. But basically, taking all of the lessons that you've learned through your journey so far. But just to round off the conversation today, um, if there was a message to that you would give to the people the people that want to address this, that they don't know how to get started, they're right at the beginning. Um, what's the message you would give to them in terms of how they could think about this and what the opportunities are?
Yeah, I would say focus on what are the drivers of your business stakeholders, because ultimately they're the end users of what you're trying to create. And if you're not creating it in a manner that is going to be useful to them, they're not going to use it, right? I mean, it's very similar to kind of the procurement analogy we talked about earlier, right? It's like if you don't understand the business, they're going to use you as a buyer's organization in procurement. They're going to send you the document once it's done and negotiated and expect you just to process it versus including you in that upfront conversation and being a true strategic partner. It's a very similar thing with the programs, right? You've got to understand what are the key drivers, but then also what are your influencers, right? So part of the MSP VMS relationship within a company is are beholden to so many different corporate functions. So finance, corporate security, right? Your legal team. So understand kind of where are their pain points that they're seeing within the business as well, because they become your advocates back to those business stakeholders saying, well, look, we had a huge accrual miss last year, and we can make sure that that doesn't happen by going through a vendor management system. Oh, we've got 1,000 resources we aren't tracking, and corporate security says we need to pass this audit or we need to have access and visibility into these resources because right now we've got people logging in from, a country that we're not allowed to be in, right? So it's like, so it's really understanding kind of that full ecosystem and what are the drivers that you can leverage to influence the business stakeholder, because ultimately it's going to be the business that drives that, especially non-mandated programs. It's going to be that business stakeholder that says, yeah, we're going to go through, yeah, we'll do this, we actually see the value. You're absolutely right.
I love it. It kind of takes us full circle, really, because it ultimately comes back to exactly as you said, understanding the business and being strategic. And ultimately, the strategic impact of this, we've seen it within the description of the journey and the program at Cox, massively value and hugely important from a strategic perspective to the whole business. So it's a fantastic success story and a really great case study. And yeah, thank you so much for talking through it. It's been an absolute pleasure to kind of drill in some of the details on it with you, and hopefully that'll be really useful to people. And it's all about building the conversation and getting the message out there. So I really appreciate your time, David. Thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, thank you for having me, Johnny.
Excellent. Cheers.